So, a big thank you to Rupert for coming all the way down from London to the Wild West to talk to us this evening. And I also want to thank a couple of other people just before we take some questions. I want to thank David Glowacki, who we were struggling to find somewhere that would actually host Rupert, because neither the scientific community nor the religious community were terribly keen on him. So we got several rejections saying, oh no, he's not Christian enough, oh, he's not scientific enough. But luckily, David Glowacki suggested that we try the Arnus Vale. So here we are. So thank you for that suggestion, David. And lastly, I wanted to thank Jess Noble and Alexei Jorineau for their artwork and for the poster they put together, all free of charge, so that we could advertise this event this evening. And so a big thank you to everyone who's contributed to this. And now if people have questions, I'm sure Rupert would be happy to take
Yes, happy to.
So put your hand up if you have a question for Rupert or for Sally. Can you say your name perhaps and then what the question is?
Okay. So my name's Jeff Webb, and the question is, well, first of all, thank you very much, Rupert, for your dazzling talk. As you said, it seems it could well be that we're on the threshold of perhaps a new, movement into spiritual and combined with modern life. But do you have any vision or visions of what might develop in the sort of future, the sort of near-term or medium-term future?
Sorry, I didn't quite get the question. It sounds very hard to hear.
Oh, sorry. Can you hear now?
Yes.
Yeah. It was about, do you have a vision for the future of our sort of spiritual development?
Well, yes. I mean, the reason I wrote these two books is precisely because I think there is a future for our spiritual development. Now, exactly what form it takes, I don't know. I mean, I myself... well, let's say we start from a position where a lot of people are not religious, but there is this great interest in spirituality. So I think there's no doubt that we'll see an evolution of spiritual interests of every kind. But I think one of the questions is to what degree they'll be expressed collectively or whether they're just individual. Now, the point about New Age spirituality is it's very individualistic. Each person has a kind of smorgasbord selection of a bit of Native American shamanism, a statue of the Buddha, possibly a Blessed Virgin Mary, incense, shamanic drumming, from a mixture of a dream catcher, crystals. So it's an individual pick and mix selection, which is fine. I mean, I'm sort of slightly guilty of some of that myself. But the trouble is it's very individual. And obviously many practices are individual. Meditation you do on your own primarily. I find connecting with nature is much better on my own. If I'm with someone else and we start chatting, the whole natural environment sort of fades into the background. I'm much more present if I'm there on my own in the natural world. So some of them are best done on one's own, but others are best done collectively. Singing and chanting together is best done in groups. The celebration of festivals and holy days is best done in groups. Prayer can be very powerful when done in groups. And so then that means either relating to existing religious traditions or inventing new ones. And there is an attempt. Alain de Botton is trying to create an atheist church. And the Sunday Assembly is an atheist church who now has about 70 branches in Britain, of people who don't want God but do want to sing together and tell uplifting stories and have a sense of community. So there's various ways in which it can be done. I mean, I myself, having been through an atheist phase, a Hindu phase, a Sufi phase, while I was living in India, found myself drawn back to a Christian path, to my surprise, and to everyone else's surprise, because I find it very helpful to relate to my own ancestral tradition and to the holy places of England, which are primarily Christian, and many of them are built on pre-Christian holy places. But I feel the connection with the holiness of the place more strongly in, say, in cathedrals built on pre-Christian holy places than on purely pre-Christian holy places that are looked after by English heritage, and, you know, like Stonehenge, where it's primarily a tourist site, and there isn't a kind of living tradition of ritual, prayer, chanting, and so on. The Druids thought that England should be enchanted through the perpetual choirs. There should be choirs chanting every day to keep our land enchanted. And actually it is enchanted through the perpetual choirs of choral evensong in all our cathedrals. So I think even if one's been put off the Christian tradition irreversibly, or if one comes from other traditions, I myself think it's important to come to terms with one's own tradition, even if one doesn't become part of it again, because otherwise there's a kind of break with ancestors, break with tradition, which, if not healed, is not necessarily very good for us. It's better to heal it. And I myself think that people who come from Jewish backgrounds would do best to connect with the deeper and more spiritual aspects of Judaism, from Muslim backgrounds with the sort of Sufi mystical tradition. The Hindu tradition's got plenty of mystical strands, and in the Christian tradition, reconnecting with the the Christian mystical tradition and the mystical theology of the pre-modern era, which is much closer to a sense of living nature and is very integrative philosophy. That's my own view. And it may be that there'll be other ways of integrating all these things. Pilgrimage is one good way of doing it, actually, because it connects to holy places, it connects to nature. And some pilgrimages, for example, in Leicester, to Leicester Cathedral, also include Hindu temples and mosques. So they can also be integrative of different religious traditions on the same pilgrimage.
My name is Maria, and thank you very much for your talk. My question is there anyone for whom meditation or spiritual practice might not be the most beneficial option? This is from an article I read where, for some people, meditation might exacerbate feelings of anxiety by forcing them to look within.
Sorry, I can't. It's very hard to hear. I'm going to come closer.
So, is there anyone for whom meditation or spiritual practices might not be beneficial?
Yeah, okay. Well, I think that some spiritual practices suit some people better than others. I mean, fasting, for example, would not be a good idea for an anorexic aged 18 who's on life support. I think that, some spiritual practices could be, psychedelics definitely could be dangerous for people who are psychotically inclined. So I think certain ones of them could be particularly dangerous for certain groups of people. I've not heard of many dangers of meditation, except that for some people who are rather isolated, it might make them more isolated socially. So I don't think there's one size fits all. And in fact, the whole point of having 14 different spiritual practices is to say there's lots of different ones, and some suit some people better than others. I mean, skiing downhill at 60 miles an hour, probably not a good idea for someone who's 90 years old and arthritic, but it might have been a very good idea at age 20. So some things work better at some stages of life than others as well. So I'm definitely not saying they're all good for everybody all the time. I think some are good for some people much of the time. And most of them are good for most people most of the time, actually.
Hi, my name is George. Thank you for a really interesting speech. Another question about the future. I'll pause. Can you hear me? Another question about the future, and it seems, there's a self-selected audience here that are susceptible and open to these ideas.
Yeah.
And it does seem the momentum is in our favour of higher consciousness. But the first speaker talked about the kind of crisis and the urgency that we have around this, and many young people feel that. So I was wondering if you could speak a bit about how we could accelerate that increasing of consciousness. And in particular, is there a language that we can use that can touch the masses rather than just people who are already inclined to believe in this sort of stuff?
Yes. Well, I think that's a very important question. I think there are certain things about existing traditions that do touch lots of people. For example, in the Middle Ages, every parish in England had a patronal festival on the day of its patron saint, when the whole village would celebrate. It was a holiday and a celebration. You still see this in Italy and Spain with their patron saints. The Puritans, in particular, and the Protestants in general, were rather against these celebrations. They thought they were occasions for immorality. No doubt they were. And they suppressed many of the festivals. They even tried to suppress Christmas and failed with Christmas. But even in the 19th century, there was an attempt to suppress Christmas. Charles Dickens's famous Christmas Carol was part of a Christmas revival movement. It wasn't a foregone conclusion at all that this would become the festival we know today. And what we've seen is a revival of popular support for festivals. Halloween is a case in point. Halloween is the eve of the Feast of All Hallows, All Saints, November the 1st, and All Souls, November the 2nd. And those, of course, are major festivals in Catholic countries. All Saints is a public holiday. And All Souls Day is the Day of the Dead, which in Mexico and in other Catholic countries is a massively popular festival involving young people, old people, everybody. Halloween, which has undergone a remarkable revival in Britain, it was suppressed after the Reformation. It survived in Scotland and Ireland, whence it went to America, and now it's come back here from America. Halloween is now a popular children's festival, but it's the eve of the Festival of the Dead, which the festival itself has been hollowed out. And I think one way is to recover a sense of these festivals. The importance of the Day of the Dead is to remember our ancestors, remember those who've gone before, and celebrate the memory of them. In Catholic countries, they go to graveyards, light candles, and I think there's great scope for reviving that. Everybody has members of the family who have died. Everyone knows people who have died. And I think making much more of the real festival, not just the eve of it, would be one way. And the other thing is another way is through summer festivals. And if you take the Glastonbury Festival, for example, what's happened is that after these great festivals are suppressed in the Reformation and by the Puritans, we've now had a huge resurgence of popular festivals which appeal primarily to younger people. The Glastonbury Festival, which has, 250,000 people going to it, happens at midsummer. The traditional maximum festival time in England and all over Europe was Midsummer's Day, June the 24th, displaced a bit from the equinox, just like Christmas is displaced a bit from the winter solstice, from the winter solstice. And I have a nephew who lives in Pilton, which is where the Glastonbury Festival happens. And a few years ago he invited me to the festival and said I could stay in his house. And that made it a much more attractive proposition than a mud-filled tent. So I went to the festival with my Wellington boots, which turned out to be very, very necessary. So I was able to sleep in his house. And on Sunday morning, as is my custom, I go to church wherever I am on Sunday morning, which means I get to visit all sorts of interesting and unusual churches. In this case, I just went to the parish church of Pilton. And it was it was June the 24th. It was the feast of St. John the Baptist. The Glastonbury Festival was in full swing. And when I walked into the parish church, on the notice board, I was amazed to see it said, the parish church of St. John the Baptist, Pilton. And so I said to the vicar after the service, you've got the biggest patronal festival in England. 250,000 people celebrating in your parish. And he looked a bit blank. He hadn't really thought it through. But I think it's true that what's happened is we've reinvented these festivals in another form. So I think that's one way in which people are already engaging in a very popular way through festivals. Pilgrimage is also quite attractive to a lot of young people. And a new initiative that's starting this coming year is that in some schools, particularly in Year 6, in primary schools, some primary schools are trying something new this year. When children leave primary school, they're starting a whole new phase of their life. They're going to a secondary school, everything is going to be different. They need a kind of rite of passage. And some schools this year are now going to take their Year 6 on pilgrimages to a local holy place, walking for several miles as far as the children can. I mean, it has to be calibrated to the abilities of the children of that age. But having pilgrimage as a kind of rite of passage for Year 6, I think is a very, very good idea. That could catch on. It hasn't happened yet, but if it's successful in the schools, it's going to happen in this coming summer. It could catch on in a big way. And then there could be rites of passage of a similar kind for people in the upper 6 after A-levels, when they're about to start a whole new phase of life. So I think that introducing rites of passage that can be inclusive for people of all backgrounds, of course they can't be compulsory, but introducing rites of passage of this kind could help to change our culture very quickly, and also at almost no cost, since walking is free. So I think there are quite a range of ways in which this could happen, and I think one of the challenges is to think of ways of helping the spiritual transformation to happen more widely. One of the points of recognizing sports as a spiritual practice is, I think, that that already has a massive popular following. It might help people to see that there's actually more going on than which team wins, and actually recognize in their own experience something that's taking them beyond their own limited personal narrow concerns. So simply reframing sports and reframing what happens when you keep a dog or a cat could affect millions of families in Britain, even if they're completely detached from any religious tradition, because these are meaningful things for many people. So I think it's partly a question of reframing and reinterpreting, and by doing that, I think that what people are doing anyway will become much more satisfying and enhance their well-being, and also help in a kind of social transition. Connecting with nature is another one, of course, and now many, in some parts of the world, in Northern Ireland and in parts of England, there are now major initiatives for forest schools and outdoor learning without walls, where children are taught outdoors much more experientially than everything just being in classrooms. And again, that could help to reconnect with the natural world, which many children are very detached from because they spend most of their time on screens. So I think there's all sorts of possibilities and initiatives here.
Hi, my name's Aria. Thank you so much. So my question is another futuristic question, just to keep it on the vein, is how do you see the future interface, fusion or possible collision of, you talk about the morphic resonance and how I've always seen it that we have a native Wi-Fi, which is the morphogenetic field that, as you say, animals have, and ourselves through our inner compass have navigated. This is a part of our intuition.
Yeah.
And now that obviously we're progressively moving into a more kind of, maybe I won't go into transhumanism, but into a field of, high-paced Wi-Fi, which for me, many contend, including myself, could and does interfere with our native Wi-Fi. And I personally even though this, high-speed train of technology, is pushing us in that direction, I'm extremely concerned, knowing I'm quite sensitive to it, although it doesn't really affect my biological, health. But I know many hypersensitive people, and so, as a spiritual practitioner, as a magician myself, I'm also really wondering, how much that's going to affect our native electromagnetic field, our native Wi-Fi, and potentially our soul sovereign potentiality, our cities, however one you can call it. Yeah.
Yes. Well, I mean, there are several levels to this, aren't there? One is the possibility of actual physical damage caused by, especially 5G when it comes in. We're going to have, 30,000 satellites. There's already 20,000 new ones being put up, beaming down everywhere on Earth, masts every 100 yards, much stronger signals. What will this do to people? And mobile phones beaming things into your brain. I mean, or men carrying them in their pockets, and with a rise in infertility. I mean, personally, I don't have a mobile phone. I just don't want to be irradiated all the time. And I also don't want people to ring me up all the time, so it's partly selfish. There's that level, and who knows, I'm not an expert on these, and I don't think anyone is. I think the whole human race is being subjected to a massive experiment without any control conditions, and driven simply by a blind faith in the advance of technology and progress. I think the use of all these social media and instant interconnection it can have good effects, but I think the main effect for most people is constant distraction. And that is definitely a downside for any kind of spiritual or mental balance. I think one of the things that in my discussion of holy days and festivals, I think one of the important things is to have a kind of technological Sabbath. I myself, on Sundays, try not to do emails or spend time with my computer or work or interact with sort of electronic media. Just be present with my family and walking outdoors, going to services, singing, music. I think that having a technological Sabbath is important for everyone's health and sanity. And that's something over which we all have some control. There's no reason any of us have to be available every single day to everybody who wants to get in touch. Unless you're a doctor on call or something like that. But even doctors on call have holidays when they don't have to be on call. So I think all these things are potential problems, but one of the things that I find most interesting is that, as a matter of fact, some intuitive skills are actually evolving alongside technology. The one that interests me most is telephone telepathy. Ever since telephones were invented, people have had the experience of thinking of someone who then rings up and they say, "That's funny, I was just thinking about you," or knowing who it is before they answer the phone. Most people have had that experience. How many people here have had that kind of experience with phones? Well, that's almost everybody. Well, you see, before the telephone was invented, no one would have had that experience because there weren't any phones. What they had in the 19th century was letters crossing in the post, where people would sit down to write to someone they knew, and then 2 or 3 days later, they'd each get a letter from the other, and it turned out they'd written them at almost the same time, and it was called letters crossing in the post. Now it's much more speeded up. And now practically everyone has phones all the time. When I was a child growing up in a small town in the Midlands, there were 20,000 people in the town near Trent. I think there were about 200 or 300 people who had telephones. Telephone numbers didn't go beyond 1,000. They were all in the hundreds. So very few people had them. Now virtually everyone has a mobile phone. And so this experience of feeling you can call anyone anytime you like and have the intention to call them means that lots of people are sending out these intentions to other people all over the world to call them. And people are responding to these intentions by thinking about them or just knowing who's calling. And so we've now reached a stage where virtually everyone's having telepathic experiences in connection with phone calls. Similar things happen with text messages and emails. I've done a lot of experiments on this to find, and I've shown it's not just coincidence. And in fact, anyone who wants to can take part in one of my experiments. In fact, I encourage you to do so. I have online telephone telepathy test. You register through my website, sheldrake.org. You put in the names of two people you know well and their numbers, and then the computer picks one of those two callers. Say I'm the subject and I've got two callers, Jill and Joe. Then it will pick Jill or Joe and ring them up and say Jill gets it. She'll answer it and say, this is Rupert's telephone telepathy test. Please think about Rupert, and when you're ready, press 1. So she presses 1. My phone rings. It says, this is your telephone telepathy test. The caller ID says, telephone telepathy test. It says, one of your two callers is on the line right now waiting to talk to you. Press 1 for Jill, press 2 for Joe. So I guess, if I guess Jill, I'm right. If I guess Joe, I'm wrong. 50% chance of being right by chance. The scores are coming in very significantly above chance. And then the line opens up and you get instant feedback as to whether you're right or wrong. Then you talk to each other. Then after a minute it cuts off because I'm paying for the call. So actually these technologies in some ways have led to some people becoming more intuitive than they were before. Because this telephone telepathy thing is by far the commonest kind. I've done surveys that show that over 90% of people have had this experience with phone calls, but with other forms of telepathy it's more like 60 or 70%. So it's by far the commonest kind. I find this encouraging that these technologies are actually bringing out these latent powers which are coming out in connection with them. Now, I think some other latent powers are being suppressed. For example, the sense of direction. No one really knows how it works. Subject I'm very interested in. But most people are never going to develop a good sense of direction if they go everywhere with GPS systems, because there'll be no need to do it. It's a mixed picture. Some things will get better and others might get worse.
Hi. Thanks so much. Over here. Hello.
Oh, yes. Oh, good thing. That's me. Yes, if you come up near me, I can hear.
Should I do this as well? Thanks so much for a really...
Use the microphone, yeah, so everyone else can hear.
Thanks so much for a really expansive and insightful talk. There's a pretty compelling argument at the moment. We're about to enter, or our generation and ones after us are going to enter a time of change, scarcity, potentially conflict. It's not totally proven. I'd like to believe otherwise. And I appreciate that if we all individually enter into more spiritual practice, that we'll be nicer people and we're less likely to sort of war with each other. But beyond that, on practical terms, are there certain areas of adopting spiritual practice or psychedelics or any of the areas you've talked about which offer humanity and the planet the greatest potential benefit in the challenges that we face? And also, what will bring that positive change about?
Well, I wish I knew the answer to that question, because obviously it's something most of us think about most of the time, or at least some of the time. I think that I think one step is to recognise that we're interconnected with each other and interconnected with the planet. And that, after all, is a realisation which is dawning on a lot of people now. I mean, when I was growing up, everyone just believed in progress. And when I first became a scientist, I believed in progress too. Science and reason and technology lead humanity to a brighter and better future. The only cloud on the landscape was sort of DDT and toxic chemicals. But most people didn't give a thought to the pollution caused by jet travel, carbon emissions, burning coal, burning gas, all these things. And then single-use plastic came, and it was just convenient. And most people just used it and thoughtlessly threw away tons of plastic every year. Well, we still do all these things. But now, people are becoming much more aware of the negative effects of these. I myself, I now think twice about going on planes. In Scandinavia, thanks to Greta Thunberg, they now have this thing called plane shame. And I think we should all have plane shame. It's one of the worst things I and everyone I know does, because you're emitting carbon fumes right into the atmosphere. Planes are extremely wasteful of energy. And right now, people are rewarded for flying more frequently, frequent flyer benefits. In fact, it should be exactly the other way around, frequent flyer taxes. People should be penalized for frequent flying. I think that this changing awareness, people are becoming more and more aware of single-use plastics. I mean, there's still far too many of them, but supermarkets are feeling they should at least show some signs of shifting towards non-wasteful use of plastics. So I think part of it is coming about through these changes in attitude. Extinction Rebellion's done a great deal to raise awareness of them. Now, of course, that's not going to stop the Indians and the Chinese building more and more coal-fired power stations. And the Chinese are building lots of them in their Belt and Road initiative in dozens of different countries. And it's very hard for us to go around the rest of the world and say, well, look, we've had all the benefits of reckless use of fossil fuels and reckless use of the world's resources, but you can't do it because now it's bad for the planet. I think all of us have to make differences in our own lives, traveling less, wasting less, consuming less, changing our diets, because eating lots of meat is one of the things that is highly destructive in the whole planet. People have to change their diets. And lots of people are. I mean, the rise of the vegan movement in Britain is astonishing, and lots of people eat far less meat than they used to. All of these things, I think, are changes in individual behavior, but also there have to be changes in economic and political behavior and legislation. And, things like, some things, signs are good. I mean, the fact that wind power, offshore wind power, is now cheaper than fossil fuels as of a few months ago is extraordinary good news, I think. And right now, these offshore wind farms produce so much electricity when it's windy, they have to shut them down because it would burn out the national grid. But actually, the next stage they're already talking about and should be doing something about soon is to have hydrogen-making plants where the electricity comes on shore. When there's too much, it's easy to make hydrogen. You put electrodes into water, salt water, and hydrogen and oxygen gas come off. And this could then be burned when there's not wind, or used to fuel jet planes or cars in a way that's not environmentally destructive. So there are technological possibilities. I'm hopeful about those, but it's not hopeful when you look at some people in the political world, like the President of the United States, who continue to deny there's a problem and who are in fact trying to unravel environmental legislation. It's obviously an enormous struggle, and I think all of us have to take part in it to the best of our ability.
Rupert, can you hear me?
No, I'll come here. The loudspeakers all point this way, and I can't hear from... Oh, if you come up here, Trevor, yes.
My name's Trevor. I had a question. We're clearly interested in God. I just wondered if you thought God was interested in us.
Oh. Well, I think that, it depends what view you have of God. I see God as sustaining all being from moment to moment, the ground of being, and also the root and source of all forms, and patterns in nature, and also the source of all the energy in nature, breath, wind, air, energy, sunlight. I see God as in nature and also beyond nature. And we're part of nature, we're within God, and I think that God is inevitably interested in us and indeed in everything else, because we're within the divine being. Now you see, this is a different view from a view that sees God as external to nature and only intervening occasionally. A view that came about in the 17th century. In the medieval theology, most people in the Christian world and in every other religious world assumed that God was in nature as well as beyond nature, a view that's called panentheism. God is everywhere and everything's in God. The idea was that we live in a living world. In the Middle Ages, plants had souls, animals had souls, the earth had souls, the planets were alive, the stars were alive, every star had its own intelligence, an angel that guarded it and looked over it and was its creative intelligence. When medieval people in England looked up into the sky, they didn't see lots of stars that were just hydrogen bombs obeying natural laws. They saw a living heavens filled with the presence and being of God, with every star a kind of intelligence. And in the 17th century, with the scientific revolution, all of nature became a machine, mechanical, made up of dead, inanimate matter, just working mechanistically. And then what role had God in this kind of world? Well, he didn't have much. His main role was to do with human morality, because the only thing that was open to God in the whole of nature were human minds, according to Descartes. Cartesian dualism split God from nature, so the whole of nature was inanimate and mechanical, including human bodies. And God, angels, and human rational minds were the only things that were non-material, and the only thing in the material world that wasn't material and that was open to God was the human mind. And God himself was supernatural or beyond nature. So there was an automatic nature going on automatically according to natural laws. God was outside nature, removed from it, accessible only through human minds, and acting only through human minds. Occasionally, it was believed in the past he intervened through miracles by suspending the laws of nature and interfering with the course of nature. But it was generally thought by the 18th century that was all in the past. That left very little room for God. God was extremely remote and had no particular reason to care for us. And then with the rise of deism in the late 18th century, people said, well, the universe needs a God to design the machinery and to fix the laws, but then once he's pressed the start button, he can just retire. So you had a God who had nothing to do with nature or humans. And then along came atheists and said, well, why bother with such a God in the first place? Let's just say the universe is eternal, then you don't need a God to start it off or to make up the laws of nature. Just get rid of God altogether. And that's what happened for many people. So I think if one has a view of God that's deistic or theistic in the mechanistic sense of theism, 17th, 18th century theology, God's outside nature, and it's not obvious why God would be concerned with what happens in nature. But if you have a view of God as immanent in all nature and in all minds and in all forms of consciousness, then it's a completely different view. It would be impossible for God not to know what's happening. I don't see any reason to assume that the divine, that bad things can't happen, because obviously bad things do happen. The universe was formed in a catastrophic explosion that disrupted its initial unity before the Big Bang. And there's been disruptive forces at work in nature ever since. That's part of evolution. They include collisions, explosions, suffering, decay, death, senescence, disease. All these things are part of the natural order. I don't think of God as a defective designer who didn't design nature properly. So why is there all this suffering in the world? So the view one takes very much depends on the kind of theology one has. And as I say, my own view is that, yes, that we're within the divine mind. Our own minds are within the divine mind. And indeed, they're part of the divine mind. I mean, the whole point of meditation, as I mentioned earlier, within the traditions that it's rooted in, is precisely to bring us into more direct conscious contact with that conscious ground of all things.
Rupert,